The flames erupted like a gateway to hell. Callum Brennan didn't think. He ran. The school bus lay on its side at the bottom of the ravine, bright yellow metal twisted and smoking against the Arizona desert. Black clouds billowed from the engine compartment, rising into the perfect September sky like a warning signal from the underworld. 22 children, 22 lives hanging by a thread. Cal's work boots scrambled down the embankment, loose rocks and sun-baked dirt cascading around him. Behind him, his foreman, Tomas Delgado, was shouting something about calling 911, but the words dissolved into white noise. All Cal could hear were the screams, high-pitched, terrified, the kind of sounds that would haunt a man's dreams for the rest of his life. He'd been patching potholes on Highway 34 when it happened. Just another day of back-breaking labor under the merciless desert sun. Just another shift of wondering if he'd be among the 20% getting laid off before Christmas. Just another morning of drinking cold coffee from a thermos because he'd learned not to be picky about small comforts. Now none of that mattered. The emergency exit door was jammed, the frame warped from the brutal impact of the crash. Cal grabbed a rock the size of his fist and brought it down on the safety glass. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th strike, the window finally shattered, raining pellets like deadly hail onto the overturned seats below. He pulled himself through the opening, ignoring how the remaining shards tore at his forearms, leaving trails of blood on the hot metal frame. Inside was chaos, smoke so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. Backpacks and lunchboxes scattered like debris from an explosion. Children crying, coughing, clawing at windows that wouldn't break. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled his lungs with every breath. Cal moved on instinct, grabbing the nearest child and pushing her toward the exit. Then another, and another. 5, 10, 15. His lungs burned like someone had poured acid into them. His eyes watered until tears streamed down his soot-covered cheeks. The temperature climbed with every passing second, the metal floor becoming hot enough to feel through his work boots. Then he saw them. 2 little girls, maybe 7 years old, identical in every way. Blonde curls matted with sweat and fear. Blue eyes wide with terror. They sat in the middle of the bus, trapped by seat belts that refused to release, holding each other like their lives depended on it. Because they did. The fire had reached the front seats now, consuming them like a hungry beast that would not be satisfied until it had devoured everything. Cal crawled over overturned seats, the metal floor searing his palms through his work gloves. When he reached the twins, one of them looked up at him with eyes that would break any parent's heart. She tried to speak, but the smoke stole her words. He pulled out his pocket knife. The blade was engraved with crooked letters that spelled, "World's Best Dad." His daughter Ellie had given it to him 3 Father's Days ago, back when she still believed in superheroes and happy endings. He never imagined he'd use it for this. The first seatbelt was tough, designed to save lives in accidents. Now it was doing the opposite. Trapping a child in a burning coffin, Cal sawed frantically, his hands shaking from smoke inhalation and pure adrenaline. The strap finally gave way. 1 down, 1 to go. The flames crept closer. He could feel them now, a wall of heat pressing against his back like the breath of something ancient and hungry and utterly without mercy. The second belt snapped. Cal grabbed both girls, tucking one under each arm like footballs. They weighed nothing. They weighed everything. They weighed more than all the gold in the world. He turned toward the exit, navigating by memory because the smoke had stolen his sight. His foot caught on something. He stumbled but didn't fall. Couldn't fall. Not with these 2 lives pressed against his chest, their small hearts beating against his ribs. The rectangle of light appeared through the haze. The emergency exit. Salvation. He pushed the girls through into waiting arms, heard someone shouting his name, felt hands reaching for him. Then the fuel tank exploded. The blast wave hit him like a freight train, lifting him off his feet and throwing him clear of the bus. He landed hard on the rocky ground, instinctively curling around himself, ears ringing, vision swimming with spots of black and white. When he opened his eyes, the bus was a fireball against the perfect blue Arizona sky. A pillar of black smoke rose into the atmosphere like a monument to disaster, and everything went dark. Callum Brennan woke to the smell of antiseptic and the steady beeping of machines. White ceiling, white walls, white bandages wrapped around both forearms like mummy wrappings. His lungs felt like someone had poured sand into them and then set it on fire. The first word from his cracked lips wasn't a question about himself. It was a name. Ellie, his daughter, 12 years old, waiting for him to pick her up from school. Probably worried sick by now, checking her phone every 30 seconds, wondering why her father wasn't answering. A nurse appeared in his field of vision, her smile professional but genuinely warm. She assured him that everything was taken care of. His neighbor, Mrs. Kowalczyk, had gotten the call from the school. Ellie was safe at home, probably eating pierogies and watching the news coverage with wide eyes. Cal's head fell back against the thin hospital pillow. Relief washed through him like cool water in the desert heat. Then the door opened. She walked in like she owned the place, which, as Cal would soon learn, she essentially did. The woman was perhaps 34, 35. Blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that was somehow still elegant enough for a magazine cover. A charcoal suit that probably cost more than Cal made in a month, maybe two. Her posture spoke of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, and a life so different from his that they might as well have come from different planets. But her eyes were red-rimmed. Her mascara had run in streaks down her carefully made-up cheeks. And when she spoke, her voice trembled in a way that no amount of money could disguise. She introduced herself as Dr. Serafina Lockwood. The two girls he'd pulled from the fire, the twins with the blonde curls and terrified blue eyes, they were her daughters. Juniper and Primrose, 7 years old, the center of her entire universe. Cal tried to sit up, suddenly acutely aware of the construction dirt still under his fingernails, the smell of smoke that probably clung to his hair, the vast gulf between his world and hers. He asked if the girls were okay, if they were scared, if they needed anything. Serafina stared at him like he'd spoken in a language she'd never heard before. She pointed out that he'd nearly died, that he'd sustained second-degree burns across his palms and forearms, that smoke inhalation had damaged his lungs, that he'd run into an inferno that any sane person would have fled from without looking back. And his first question was about her children. Cal didn't understand why that was strange. They'd been so scared, those two little girls. He just needed to know they were all right. He needed to know that the nightmare was over for them. The tears that had been threatening spilled over, cutting fresh tracks through Serafina's ruined makeup. She told him they were perfect. Thanks to him, they were absolutely perfect. The doctors had checked them twice, and they didn't have so much as a scratch. She pulled out her phone, showing him something on the screen. A news article, maybe, or a company website. The words Lockwood Medical Holdings stood out in bold letters, followed by a number that made Cal's head spin. 52 hospitals, spread across the United States from coast to coast, a net worth measured not in millions but in billions. And today, Serafina said, her voice cracking on every word, all of that money couldn't save her daughters. A construction worker with a pocket knife and work boots had done what $4.2 billion couldn't. She asked him what he wanted. Anything, she said. Name it. Money, a house, a car, a new life. She would give him anything he asked for, no questions asked, no strings attached. Cal looked at this woman, this titan of industry who had walked into his hospital room like a supplicant approaching a shrine. He thought about his apartment with the water stain on the ceiling that he kept meaning to fix, the stack of bills on his kitchen table that never seemed to get smaller, the shoes Ellie needed for school, the job he might not have by Christmas. Then he thought about Rachel, his wife, dead 3 years now, but still present in every corner of his life. Before the accident took her, before a drunk driver ran a red light and changed everything forever, she'd told Cal that his hands might be rough, but his heart was the softest thing she'd ever known. 3 years. It still felt like yesterday. It still felt like forever. Rachel would have laughed at the idea of him taking money for doing what any decent person would do. She would have kissed his forehead and told him that was exactly why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. He told Serafina he didn't need anything. His union insurance would cover the medical bills. He appreciated the offer more than he could say, but he was fine. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve, a code she couldn't crack, a mystery that defied everything she knew about human nature. Later, Cal would learn that this was the first time in 15 years anyone had refused her anything. The apartment was quiet when Cal finally got home that evening. Garden View Apartments, a generous name for a complex that hadn't seen a garden since the Reagan administration. But the schools were good, the neighbors were decent, and Mrs. Kowalczyk always had pierogies ready when Cal worked late. That was enough. It had to be enough. He climbed the stairs to the second floor slowly, every step a reminder of muscles he'd strained and skin he'd burned. His bandaged hands made gripping the railing painful, but he managed. He always managed. Before he could get his key in the lock, the door flew open. Ellie stood there, 12 years old and already showing hints of the woman she'd become. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, and right now those eyes were filling with tears that she was desperately trying to blink away. She'd seen the news, all of it, the burning bus, the rescue, the hero construction worker who'd saved 22 children, her father's face on every channel. She started to throw herself at him, then stopped when she saw the bandages wrapped around his arms. Cal pulled her close anyway, ignoring the protest from his burns. Some things were more important than pain. She asked if it hurt. He lied and said not too much. They stood in the doorway for a long moment, father and daughter, holding each other like the world might end if they let go. The evening light filtered through the hallway window, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Then Ellie pulled back. Her expression shifted into something harder, something older than her 12 years should allow. She told him that her mother used to say he was nobody special. Just another construction worker going nowhere. Just another man without ambition or dreams. Cal's chest tightened. Even 3 years later, Deirdre's words could still cut him to the bone. But Ellie wasn't finished. She said her mother was wrong. She said he was the most special person in the whole world. Those kids on the news, all 22 of them, they were alive because of him, because he ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. Cal didn't know what to say. He'd spent 3 years hearing echoes of Deirdre's voice in his head, telling him he wasn't enough, wasn't successful enough, ambitious enough, worthy enough of love or respect or anything good. He'd started to believe it, but here was his daughter looking at him like he'd hung the moon and stars. She took his bandaged hand carefully, leading him inside. She said she'd made dinner. Well, Mrs. Kowalczyk had made dinner, but Ellie had supervised. That counted for something, right? As they sat down to pierogies and kielbasa, Ellie told him something that would stay with Cal for the rest of his life. She said that the things that really matter can't be bought with money, like how he'd slept in a hospital chair for 3 nights when she had appendicitis, refusing to leave her side even when the nurses begged him to go home and rest, like how he'd learned Common Core math just to help her with homework, even though numbers made his head spin, like how he'd run into fire to save children he'd never met. Rachel had understood that too. Before the accident, she'd always said that Cal's heart was worth more than any bank account. Cal's throat was too tight to respond. His daughter, 12 years old, understood something that Deirdre never had. Love wasn't measured in bank accounts or job titles or square footage. It was measured in sacrifice. The call came 2 days later. A man named Thaddeus Pemberton, Dr. Lockwood's personal attorney. His voice was measured and professional, carrying the weight of expensive education and decades of practice. But there was something beneath it, respect maybe, or genuine curiosity. He explained that Dr. Lockwood wanted to offer Cal a position, Director of Facilities and Safety at Lockwood Medical Center. The salary was $95,000 a year, full benefits, flexible hours so he could be there for his daughter. Cal nearly dropped the phone. He told the attorney he was just a construction worker. He didn't have a college degree. He barely knew how to send an email. Pemberton said that was precisely why Dr. Lockwood wanted him. He understood systems and how they failed. He understood safety and why it mattered. And he ran toward fires when everyone else ran away. Those qualities, Pemberton said, couldn't be taught in any university. After hanging up, Cal stood at his window, looking out at the Phoenix skyline, glittering in the distance. Somewhere in that sea of lights was Lockwood Medical Center. Somewhere was a life he'd never imagined. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. The words were cruel and cutting. Something about knowing his place. About construction workers not belonging at the table with elites. About everyone eventually seeing what he really was. A nobody. Nothing special. Cal deleted the message, but the words had already burrowed under his skin like splinters. He thought about his father, dead 20 years now, who drunk himself into an early grave because he couldn't handle being ordinary in an extraordinary world. He thought about Deirdre, who'd walked out because she deserved more than a man who came home with dirt under his fingernails. He thought about Ellie, who looked at him like he was a hero. Which version was true? Was he nobody special, like the text said? Or was he something more? Cal didn't know, but for the first time in 3 long years, he wanted to find out. The Lockwood Medical Center rose 18 stories into the Arizona sky, all glass and steel and modern architecture that seemed to defy gravity. Cal parked his battered Ford F-150 between a Tesla and a BMW, feeling like he'd driven into an alternate universe where his truck was an alien spacecraft. His work boots, no matter how hard he'd scrubbed them the night before, still carried traces of construction site dust. Gwendolyn Fairfax met him in the marble-floored lobby. 58 years old, silver hair in a practical bun, kind eyes that had seen everything and judged nothing. She was the current facilities manager, 2 weeks from retirement and tasked with training her unlikely replacement. She told him not to worry about the looks he was getting. 30 years ago, she'd walked into the same building in army nurse boots with no idea what a computer even was. Cal admitted he barely knew how to send an email. His daughter usually helped him with anything technological. Gwen laughed, a warm sound that echoed off the high ceilings. She said Dr. Lockwood's grandmother, the original founder, had hired her because she understood systems and people. Now the granddaughter was hiring Cal for exactly the same reason. The first few weeks were brutal in ways Cal hadn't anticipated. He spent 30 minutes trying to send a single email, accidentally CCing the entire maintenance department on a message meant for one person. He struggled with the scheduling software, which seemed designed by people who hated simplicity. He overheard maintenance workers snickering behind his back about the construction guy playing executive. But then came the moment that changed everything. The NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, where the tiniest and most fragile patients fought for their lives, had been having ventilation issues for 8 long months. 3 professional contractors with impressive credentials had examined the system. None had found the problem. Cal found it in 45 minutes. Airflow was airflow, he explained to the stunned maintenance team, while pointing at a junction they'd all overlooked. Whether you were in a construction site or a hospital, the principles didn't change. You just had to know where to look. Word spread through the building like wildfire. The new director, the hero who'd saved 22 children, had solved in an hour what experts couldn't solve in months. Maybe he belonged here after all. The first dinner at the Lockwood estate came 3 weeks into Cal's new employment. The house wasn't what he'd expected. No ostentatious mansion with gold fixtures and marble columns. It was beautiful in a subtle way. Glass, stone, and desert landscaping that seemed to grow naturally from the Arizona soil. Modern but warm, a home, not a showpiece. Juniper and Primrose exploded through the front door the moment Cal's truck pulled up in the circular driveway. They'd been waiting by the window for an hour, their mother would later admit with an embarrassed smile. The twins dragged Ellie inside before she could even say hello. There was a robot they needed to show her, a real robot, one that Rosie had programmed to solve a Rubik's Cube in under 2 minutes. Cal watched his daughter disappear into what the girls called their lab, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for years. Ellie had always been quiet at school, too smart for most kids her age, too interested in things they didn't care about. She'd never really had friends who understood her passion for science and numbers, and how things worked. Now here were 2 7-year-olds hanging on her every word like she was a goddess descended from Mount Olympus. In the kitchen, Serafina was cooking. Gone was the charcoal armor of the boardroom. In its place, a flour-dusted apron, bare feet on Italian tile, hair falling in waves she hadn't bothered to tame. She looked like someone Cal might have met at a neighborhood barbecue. Someone real, someone touchable. She asked if he could cook. Cal admitted his entire repertoire consisted of spaghetti and more spaghetti. Sometimes he got fancy and added meatballs. Sarah laughed, and the sound surprised him. It wasn't the polished, professional laugh of a CEO accepting an award. It was real, warm, the kind of laugh that crinkled the corners of her eyes and made her look 10 years younger. She put him to work chopping vegetables while she stirred her grandmother's secret sauce recipe. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, moving around each other in the kitchen like they'd done it 100 times before. Then Sarah spoke. She needed to tell him something, something important. Cal's hands stilled on the cutting board. She admitted she'd had him investigated, full background check. She knew about Deirdre, about the divorce, about the custody battle that had nearly broken him. She knew about the financial struggles, the months he'd worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. It was a bad habit from her world, she said, investigating everyone who got close. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She apologized. Cal set down the knife. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He thought about being angry, thought about feeling violated. But when he looked at Sarah, he saw something he recognized. Fear. The same fear he carried every day. Fear of being hurt. Fear of trusting the wrong person. Fear of opening your heart only to have it crushed. She'd built walls around herself, just like he had. Different materials, maybe. Hers were made of money and power and background checks. His were made of long work hours and emotional distance, and the belief that he didn't deserve anything better. But walls were walls, and they were both tired of living behind them. He asked what she'd found in her investigation. Sarah's voice softened. She said she'd found a man who raised his daughter alone for 3 years without ever saying a bad word about his ex-wife, even when he had every right to be bitter. A man who kept his child in advanced classes despite working overtime to pay the extra fees. A man who skipped lunches so his daughter could have new shoes for school. She said she'd found an extraordinary father, and she wanted him to know that he didn't have to feel like he didn't belong here. Cal told her he understood. In her world, trust was a liability that could cost you everything. In his world, it was all he had. Maybe they could find somewhere in between. Sarah's eyes glistened in the warm kitchen light. She said she'd like that. The storm arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the bus rescue. Cal was meeting with his maintenance team in the facility's office when the commotion started in the main lobby. A woman's voice, sharp and demanding, cutting through the professional murmur of the hospital like a knife through silk. He knew that voice. He'd been married to it for 7 years. Deirdre stood near the security desk, designer dress and Hermes bag, auburn hair styled to perfection despite the desert wind outside. Beside her was a man Cal didn't recognize, tall, silver-tempered, with the bearing of someone who had never in his life heard the word no. Barrett Kessler, real estate developer. Deirdre's new husband, worth more than Cal would make in 10 lifetimes. Cal noticed a boy trailing behind them, maybe 10 years old, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Deirdre's nephew, if Cal remembered correctly from old family photos, the same nephew who'd been on that bus 6 weeks ago. The same nephew Cal had carried to safety without knowing whose family he belonged to. Deirdre didn't acknowledge the connection, didn't thank him, didn't even glance at the boy she'd nearly lost. When she spotted Cal approaching, her lips curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. She looked him up and down, taking in the clean clothes and the director's badge on his chest. Her voice dripped with something between amusement and thinly veiled contempt. From pouring concrete to playing executive, she said. She'd heard he saved the CEO's children and got rewarded with a job. Clever strategy. She didn't know he had it in him. Cal's jaw tightened. He told her this didn't concern her. Whatever she wanted, this wasn't the place. But it did concern her, Deirdre insisted. She was there about Ellie, her daughter. She'd heard the girl was spending time with rich children, learning to solve problems with her fists, being exposed to inappropriate relationships. As a mother, she had a right to be concerned. Sarah appeared from the elevator, drawn by the raised voices that were beginning to attract attention. Deirdre turned to assess her, the way a predator sizes up potential competition. She called Sarah the woman who was playing house with her family. Sarah's response was ice cold, each word precise and cutting. She pointed out that Deirdre had abandoned that family 3 years ago. She'd forfeited the right to call it hers. Something flickered in Deirdre's perfectly made-up eyes. Calculation, hunger, the look of someone who had spotted an opportunity. She reached into her designer bag and produced a manila envelope, legal papers, a custody petition stamped and filed with the county court. She was suing for full custody of Ellie. The envelope landed at Cal's feet with a soft thud that sounded like thunder. Deirdre's parting shot was aimed squarely at Sarah. She said money couldn't buy everything. Some things mattered more than bank accounts, like a mother's rights under the law. Then she was gone, heels clicking on marble, Barrett Kessler's hand possessive on the small of her back. The nephew trailed behind them, forgotten. That night, Cal and Sarah sat at his small kitchen table, the custody petition spread between them like a declaration of war. The allegations were brutal. Cal's heroics on the highway were reframed as reckless endangerment. 2 fires in 6 weeks, the document noted, creating an unstable environment for a child. His relationship with Dr. Lockwood was characterized as inappropriate influence on a minor. Ellie's fight at school was cited as evidence of violent tendencies fostered by inadequate parenting. Cal stared at the words until they blurred together into meaningless shapes. He said Deirdre didn't care about Ellie. If she did, she would have been there. For the birthdays, for the school plays, for the emergency surgery. She'd seen his name in the papers next to Sarah's and wanted something. Money, revenge, control, something. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. She was about to respond when a small voice came from the doorway. Ellie stood there in her pajamas, eyes swollen from crying she'd done alone in her room. She needed to tell them something. About why she'd hit Madison Hayes. The real reason. Cal's heart cracked open. Ellie sat down and the words poured out like water from a broken dam. Madison had been tormenting her for 2 solid weeks, saying that Cal only saved those kids because he knew their mother was rich, that he'd looked up who was on the bus before running in, that he was a nobody trying to climb the social ladder through manipulation and luck. Ellie had tried to ignore it, tried to be the bigger person, like her father had always taught her. But then Madison said something else, something about Cal not deserving anyone or anything good in his life, and Ellie couldn't take it anymore. Cal pulled his daughter close. Why hadn't she told him? Because he already had enough to deal with, she said. The new job, the injuries that still hadn't fully healed, the stress of everything changing so fast. She didn't want to add to his burden. She wanted to protect him for once. She pulled back and looked at him with eyes that held far too much wisdom for 12 years. She said she wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She would do it again if she had to, because he deserved to be defended. He spent his whole life protecting everyone else, his family, strangers on a burning bus, sick children in a hospital. Who protected him? Sarah moved to stand beside them, her hand coming to rest on Cal's shoulder. She said she would. She would protect both of them, whatever it took. The weeks before the trial passed in a blur of legal preparation and sleepless nights. Thaddeus Pemberton, Sarah's attorney, reviewed Cal's documentation with something approaching professional awe. 3 years of meticulous records, organized in folders and subfolders. Every missed phone call logged with date and time. Every broken promise recorded. Every birthday card that never came. Every visit that was canceled at the last minute. Cal explained that he'd kept it all because he thought maybe, someday, Deirdre would come back wanting to be a real mother. He'd wanted to be able to show her what she'd missed, hoping it would motivate her to change. Thad said it was the clearest evidence of parental abandonment he'd ever seen in 30 years of family law. Deirdre didn't stand a chance if they played it right. But there was a complication. Her lawyer was Patricia Stone, a shark in family law who hadn't lost a custody case in 5 years. She would attack every angle, exploit every weakness, especially Cal's relationship with Sarah. Cal insisted they were just friends. Thad raised a skeptical eyebrow. He said Cal's feelings were obvious to anyone with functioning eyes. But that wasn't a problem. 2 single parents finding each other through extraordinary circumstances wasn't illegal or immoral. They would make it an asset, not a liability. The night before the hearing, Sarah called when the moon was high over Phoenix. Neither of them could sleep. She told him about her ex-husband, Richard, a hedge fund manager who'd made millions moving numbers from one column to another, creating wealth for people who already had too much. He'd never fought for custody of the twins, not because Sarah was a better parent, But because he simply didn't want the children at all, he called them a burden on his career, a distraction from what really mattered. He saw them twice a year and sent expensive gifts to compensate for his absence. When she watched Deirdre fight tooth and nail for Ellie despite abandoning her for 3 years, Sarah had realized something important. Deirdre didn't want Ellie, not really. She wanted to win, to control, to prove she could take anything she set her sights on. Cal asked if she was afraid of what tomorrow would bring. No, Sarah said, her voice steady as steel. She was angry, righteously, powerfully angry, and she would not let anyone destroy what they were building together. What they were building. Cal held on to those words through the long, sleepless night. They felt like a promise. They felt like hope. The Maricopa County Family Courthouse smelled of old wood and decades of accumulated anxiety. Cal sat at the respondent's table, Thaddeus Pemberton beside him in an impeccable three-piece suit. Sarah, a steady presence in the gallery row directly behind. Across the aisle, Deirdre sat with Patricia Stone and Barrett Kessler, whose expressions suggested he'd rather be closing real estate deals than sitting through family court proceedings. Judge Miriam Castellanos took her seat at the bench. 60 years old, silver hair pulled back severely, eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. She had a reputation for cutting through nonsense with surgical precision. Patricia Stone rose first, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Her client, she explained in measured tones, had built a stable and prosperous life in Scottsdale. She could provide Eliza with opportunities that Mr. Brennan simply couldn't match. Better schools, better neighborhoods, better prospects for the future. Furthermore, Mr. Brennan's documented pattern of reckless behavior, running into not one but 2 fires in the span of 6 weeks, demonstrated an unstable environment unsuitable for raising a child. Eliza herself had exhibited violent tendencies, breaking a classmate's nose in a schoolyard altercation, and the relationship with Dr. Lockwood, a woman he'd known mere months, showed poor judgment in choosing influences for his impressionable daughter. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Thad rose slowly, deliberately, letting the silence build before he spoke. He presented the court with 3 years of meticulous documentation. In 36 months since the divorce was finalized, Mrs. Kessler had seen her daughter exactly 4 times. She'd missed 41 school events, including every single science fair where Eliza had won first place. When Eliza required emergency appendectomy surgery 2 years ago, Mr. Brennan had called his ex-wife 7 times from the hospital waiting room. No one answered. Not once. As for the allegedly reckless heroics, Thad continued, his voice gaining strength, Mr. Brennan had saved 22 children from a burning school bus, including Mrs. Kessler's own nephew, a fact she'd conveniently omitted from her petition. His quick thinking at the hospital had prevented a kitchen fire from spreading to the pediatric ward, potentially saving dozens more young lives. This wasn't recklessness. This was heroism of the highest order. Judge Castellanos listened impassively, her pen scratching notes. Then she asked to hear from Eliza herself. Cal's heart clenched as his daughter walked to the witness stand. She looked small up there, dwarfed by the dark wood and formal architecture of the courtroom. But her back was straight, her chin lifted, her eyes clear. She told the judge about her father, about how he woke at 5 in the morning and came home at 7 at night, exhausted beyond words, but still sat with her to work through algebra problems she didn't understand. About how he'd taught himself a Common Core math because she needed help, spending hours watching tutorial videos even though numbers made his head spin. She told the judge about her appendectomy 2 years ago, how her father had refused to leave the hospital for 72 hours straight, how he'd survived on vending machine coffee and worry, never once complaining, never once leaving her side. Her mother hadn't answered the phone. Patricia Stone tried to interject something about distance and circumstances in California. Ellie's response was quietly devastating. She pointed out that her mother had posted pictures from 3 Hawaiian vacations that same year. She'd seen them on Instagram. Hawaii wasn't any farther from Phoenix than California was. The courtroom went silent. Judge Castellanos asked about Dr. Lockwood and her role in Ellie's life. Ellie's face softened, the hard edges melting away. She said Dr. Sarah wasn't trying to replace her mother. She was just there. When Ellie needed to ask questions, she couldn't ask her father. when she wanted to talk about science with someone who truly understood. And the twins, Uni and Rosie, they were like the little sisters she'd always wanted. They didn't care whether her father was a construction worker or a director or anything else. They loved him because he was kind and patient and good. Then Ellie turned to look directly at her mother across the courtroom. Her voice didn't waver, not even slightly. She said her mother used to say her father was nobody special, just a construction worker going nowhere. But her mother was wrong. Her father was the one who stayed. Every single day, no matter how hard it got. Her mother was the one who left. She didn't want to go to Scottsdale or anywhere else. She wanted to stay with her father, with Dr. Sarah, with Uni and Rosie, with the people who actually loved her. Judge Castellanos asked if she had anything else to add. Ellie nodded, composing herself. She said someone once asked her what a hero was. She'd thought about it for a long time after her father ran into that burning bus. A hero wasn't someone who was never afraid. A hero was someone who was terrified, but did the right thing anyway. Her father was scared every day. Scared he didn't have enough money. Scared he wasn't doing enough as a single parent. Scared of disappointing her. But he showed up anyway, every single day, without fail. That, Ellie said with quiet conviction, was a real hero. Judge Castellanos delivered her verdict with the weight of absolute authority. The petition was denied. Mr. Brennan would retain full custody as established in the original divorce agreement. If Mrs. Kessler wished to expand her visitation rights in the future, she would need to demonstrate 6 consecutive months of consistent, meaningful involvement in her daughter's life first. The judge looked directly at Deirdre, her gaze unflinching. She said parenthood wasn't a part-time job you could pick up when convenient and set down when it interfered with your lifestyle. You couldn't abandon a child for 3 years and then waltz back into her life expecting rights you hadn't earned. The gavel came down with finality. Cal couldn't move, couldn't breathe. 3 years of fear and struggle and doubt and endless worry, and it was over. Just like that. Ellie crashed into his arms, sobbing with relief against his chest. Sarah was there too, wrapping her arms around both of them, tears streaming down her face. Across the aisle, Deirdre stood frozen in place. Barrett was already gathering his things, phone in hand, clearly eager to leave this embarrassment behind and get back to business. But Deirdre didn't move. She was watching them. Cal, Sarah, Ellie. The family she'd thrown away like last season's fashion. And for the first time since Cal had known her carefully constructed mask cracked. Not anger, not calculation, not wounded pride. Something rawer, something more human, something that looked almost like grief. She walked over slowly, her heels making no sound on the courtroom carpet. Her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper. She told Ellie she did love her, in her own way, as best as she knew how. Ellie looked at her mother for a long, measuring moment. Then she said she knew. She'd always known, somewhere deep down. But love didn't mean anything without action. Her father loved her through action, every single day in 1,000 small ways. Her mother had loved herself more than she'd loved her daughter. Deirdre flinched as though she'd been struck. Yes, she admitted quietly. She had. She'd chosen her own happiness over her daughter's needs. She could see that now. Ellie reached out and touched her mother's hand, just briefly, a gesture of something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but might someday grow into it. She said she hoped her mother would find real happiness someday, genuine happiness, not just the appearance of it. Then she turned away, back to her father, back to Sarah, back to the family that had chosen her every single day. Deirdre stood alone for a moment, looking smaller than Cal had ever seen her. Then she walked out of the courtroom, her heels echoing in the heavy silence. She wasn't a villain anymore, just a woman who had made terrible choices and finally painfully understood the cost. Outside the courthouse, the Arizona sun blazed down on the marble steps. Junie and Rosie were waiting by Sarah's car, having convinced their driver to pick them up early from school. They'd refused to miss this moment, no matter what the adults said. The twins launched themselves at Ellie with the force of small blonde missiles. Rosie asked if Ellie was staying. Please, please, please say she was staying. Ellie laughed through her tears. Real laughter, the kind Cal hadn't heard from her in months. She was staying. The girls cheered loud enough to draw stares from lawyers and litigants streaming out of the courthouse. Cal and Sarah stood slightly apart from the celebration, watching their daughters create chaos on the courthouse steps. Sarah spoke first. She said she loved him. The words were direct, unvarnished, without corporate spin or careful phrasing. Just truth, raw and simple. She said she loved him not because he saved her children, though she'd be grateful for that until the day she died. She loved him because he was the kind of man who ran into fire without knowing who was inside. Because he'd taught her that integrity mattered more than status. Because he looked at her and saw a person, not a bank account or a business opportunity or a trophy to be won. Cal took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his calloused palm. He told her about Rachel, his first wife. Before the accident took her, before a drunk driver ran a red light and ended everything, she'd made him promise something. If anything ever happened to her, he needed to find someone who would love Ellie the way she did. Someone who would see their daughter for the miracle she was. He'd never thought he could keep that promise. Never thought he deserved to. Until now. They kissed for the first time, right there on the courthouse steps, with pigeons cooing overhead and traffic humming in the distance. Ellie's voice rang out behind them, cutting through the moment. Finally, she said, her exasperation theatrical and affectionate. Did they have any idea how frustrating it had been watching them dance around each other for weeks? The twins chimed in enthusiastically. They'd been ready to lock them in a closet until they figured it out. Sarah laughed. Cal laughed. Even some passing strangers smiled at the scene. A family being born in the most unlikely of places. A new family, forged in fire and legal battles and the simple, stubborn choice to love, even when it was terrifying. 1 year later, Cal stood on Highway 34 as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the exact spot where the bus had crashed, where his old life had ended and his new one had begun. The scrub brush had grown back, hiding the scars in the earth. But he could still see it in his mind's eye. The smoke, the flames, the desperate faces of children pressed against windows. There was a sign there now, bronze letters on desert stone that caught the dying light. Brennan's Crossing. For those who run toward fire when others run away. Dedicated to the 22 children and the man who saved them. A car pulled up behind him on the gravel shoulder. Not his old Ford F-150 anymore, though he'd kept it for sentimental reasons. This was a family SUV, practical, reliable. Enough room for 5 people and all their chaos. Sarah emerged first, elegant even in jeans and a simple blouse. Then Ellie, 13 now and growing more confident by the day. Then Junie and Rosie, who immediately began investigating a lizard they'd spotted near the memorial stone. 5 of them now, a family in every way that mattered. The twins ran to read the sign, sounding out Cal's name with obvious pride, arguing over who got to trace the letters first. Ellie stood beside her father, her hand finding his the way it always did at important moments. She asked if he remembered when she'd told him what a hero was, back during the trial, when everything hung in the balance. He remembered every word. She said she'd been wrong about something. Cal looked at her surprised. Ellie explained. A hero wasn't just someone who did the right thing despite being scared. That was part of it, but not all. A hero was someone who found a reason to fight, something worth protecting, someone worth saving. And his reason, her father's reason, had always been them. Cal's throat tightened with emotion he didn't try to hide. Rosie tugged at Sarah's sleeve, interrupting the moment with the urgency only 7-year-olds possessed. She had a question, a really important question. She wanted to know if Ellie could be their real sister. Not sister-like. Sister for real and forever. Sarah looked at Cal, eyebrows raised. Cal looked at Ellie, letting her decide. Ellie knelt down to the twins' level, her expression mock serious. She asked if they really wanted her as a real sister. Because real sisters were annoying. Real sisters borrowed things without asking and ate the last cookie and knew all your embarrassing secrets. Both girls nodded so vigorously their blonde curls bounced. Ellie pretended to think about it, stroking her chin like a philosopher considering a great mystery. Fine, she said at last. But there were conditions. They had to call her Big Sister and listen to her at least 60% of the time and let her have first pick of the Halloween candy. The twins shouted their agreement, launching themselves at Ellie in a tackle hug that nearly knocked her over. The sun was setting over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep burning red. The kind of sunset that made you believe in something bigger than yourself. 5 people stood before the memorial. Cal and Sarah, hands intertwined like they'd been holding on to each other forever. Ellie with an arm around each twin, the 3 of them already bickering affectionately about something inconsequential. Cal thought about the man he'd been a year ago, worried about layoffs and unpaid bills, struggling to keep his head above water, believing deep in the darkest part of his heart that maybe Deirdre was right. Maybe he really was nobody special. Maybe he didn't deserve anything good. Now he had a job that meant something, a woman who loved him for exactly who he was. 3 daughters who looked at him like he'd hung the stars in the sky just for them. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, fitting there like she'd always belonged. She asked what he was thinking about, standing there so quiet. Cal watched Ellie teaching the twins some complicated clapping game, their laughter carrying on the desert wind like music. He said he was thinking about fire. Sarah waited for him to continue. He said that a year ago, he'd run into flames because he couldn't stand the thought of children dying when he might be able to help. He hadn't known that on that bus were 2 little girls whose mother would change his life forever. He hadn't known that running toward destruction would lead him here, to construction, to family, to home. Sometimes, he said, you had to walk through hell to find heaven. Sometimes the man who ran into fire was the one who got saved. Sarah kissed him softly, her lips tasting of desert wind and forever promises. She said he was never nobody. He just needed someone smart enough to see what had been there all along. The twins called out to them, demanding everyone gather for a picture. It was important, they insisted with 7-year-old gravity. Family photos were extremely important. They'd learned that in school. Cal smiled, feeling muscles in his face that hadn't been used in years. Deirdre had looked at him and seen a man going nowhere. A construction worker with dirt under his fingernails and nothing to offer. She couldn't have been more wrong. He was a father, a husband soon. Sarah had said yes just last month. A protector of children, both his own and strangers. A man who ran toward fire because that was simply who he was, who he'd always been, who he would always be. And that was all the special he'd ever need to be. The camera clicked, capturing 5 faces against the Arizona sunset. 5 smiles bright enough to rival the dying sun. 5 people who'd found each other through tragedy and trial and the simple refusal to give up. A family forged in fire. A love born from ashes. A future as bright as the flames that had started it all. The end.